Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam Nasser, and this is the Cleveland C# User Group. A little bit about the group. We meet every month. The meetings are free of charge and open to the public, and we cover a variety of topics related to .NET. You can find all meeting information for both past as well as future meetings posted at meetup.com at the link listed at the bottom of the slide. We'd like to give a big thank you to our sponsors, the .NET Foundation for sponsoring the Meetup website, and NIS Technologies for sponsoring the virtual meeting space. If you're joining us for the first time, some general information. First and foremost, please keep in mind participation is always encouraged. Regardless whether you agree or disagree, always feel free to jump in with any questions or comments. And like I always say, the only stupid question is the one not being asked. However, when not speaking, kindly ask you to mute your microphones just to avoid any background noise. And we want to keep it casual but organized, meaning feel free to jump in with any questions or comments, either in chat or verbally. But at the same time, we want to give enough time for our speaker to go through the slides and the demos. Lastly, the presentation is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube in just a few short days. So for tonight's feature presentation, we have Scott Sauber from Lean Techniques, and he's going to be presenting on 10 things I do on every .NET app. Scott is the Director of Engineering for Lean Techniques. He's also a Microsoft MVP, a Redgate Community Ambassador, and you can find him as an international speaker at various conferences and user groups, a Dome Train author, and he co-organizes the Iowa.NET user group. In addition, you can find many of his postings and articles posted at scottsauber.com. So with that, let me turn it over to Scott. Scott, glad to have you with us tonight. Thank you for joining.
Perfect. Thanks, Sam. So yeah, like Sam said, we're going to be talking about 10 things I do on every .NET app. There's really like probably 40 things in here, but that sounds overwhelming. So really but it's kind of an umbrella of 10 things that I do on every .NET app. I have not posted these slides quite yet on my blog, but I will do that afterwards. So it's just my first last name.com. You can find other versions of this presentation out there as well, but this exact version I haven't posted quite yet, but I'll do that right after this. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I am Scott Sauber there. All right, so really kind of my target audience, because you all are taking your time away for to learn about this, so I want to make sure that you're in the right spot. And really, the target audience I have for this, as you might guess, are .NET developers, but people who are interested specifically in making maintainable applications, because pretty much everything I'm going to talk about is about making maintainable applications. So hopefully that Venn diagram of like .NET developers who care about maintainable apps is more like an overlapping circle, and hopefully all .NET developers care about that, but that's kind of who I'm targeting here. So we're going to talk about all these things. I'm not going to read these all out to you, but really how this talk is structured is as a series of lightning talks. And because what I found is like, I've given a number of talks before, and I feel like I could have summarized most of those talks in like 5 minutes or so to get to like the meat of it. But there's, a lot of storytelling that goes on and some of those kinds of things. And so I was like, what if I make a talk that's just like the meat of all those topics? And so that's kind of what the structure of this talk is a lot of just pure meat. But we're also going to move pretty fast. So we're going to switch between these different topics, which are loosely related because it's all related to .NET, but they are definitely separate topics in of themselves. Like, for instance, we'll talk about automated testing a little bit, and that's like a whole all-day workshop we could talk about, but I'm going to talk about a few key things with regards to that. So that's kind of the agenda we've got. And so if you're not really vibing with a particular topic that I'm talking about, just hold on for 5 minutes because we'll get through that topic and then we'll move on to another one. So, but really some goals I have out of this is I want to expose you to some new ideas, and hopefully you take away some of those ideas back to work. I was mentioning earlier when somebody joined about like, you're probably not going to agree with everything I say, and that's totally okay, but hopefully you agree with like one or two things, or you're like, something comes up there like, oh, I've never thought about that before. Like, that's cool. Because I would say a lot of these things are not the out of the box way you do things. If you go like file new project in Visual Studio or .NET New and create new project, some of these are like pulling in different packages or using different techniques that don't come directly out of the box. So hopefully you get some new ideas out of this. I'm pretty flexible. Like I don't want to just like, if you have a question, feel free to just like shout it out or raise your hand. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat. And I guess, Sam, if you see anything that I'm not seeing, feel free to call my attention to it. But literally just unmute and ask a question if you have a question. Like I'm okay keeping this really collaborative and casual and all that kind of stuff. So I don't really need to go over the who am I slide because Sam already did that for me. So let's just dive right into it. So I really like, I would say the kind of the basis of this talk comes from this tweet here of, this is from Guillermo Rauch. For those of you who don't know, he created a company called Vercel, which they create, it's not really in the .NET ecosystem, it's more in the JavaScript Node ecosystem, but they create like Next.js, and he created Socket.io, which is like a SignalR equivalent in Node. But I really like this tweet that he had almost 10 years ago now of every system tends towards complexity, slowness, and difficulty, and staying simple, fast, and easy to use is a battle that must be fought every day. And I totally feel this because I've worked at companies where it's like a very lean team, and even like, especially in the market nowadays, I feel like more and more teams are asked to do more with less. And honestly, staying simple as you can is totally something that you need to like keep in the forefront of your mind. And it's super easy to go to like the more complex things, or like, oh, I totally need to add Kubernetes to this and host this in Kubernetes for like my 10 user app. And most likely you don't. And Kubernetes is like its own thing, and nothing against people using Kubernetes. It's just like, that's probably not the simplest solution that you could find. And so a lot of this talk is really about like, how do we make our applications more maintainable, and for both the short term and the long term, because like anybody can pump out a lot of code very fast, especially with AI nowadays, but in like to have it do like what you want it to do now. But then when like a business person comes to you and is like, oh, hey, I want it to do this other thing, like if you're weighed down by your tech debt and you're not able to move it fast, like it's going to slow your business down tremendously. So this is kind of like, this tweet is kind of top of mind as we kind of do this talk. So with that, let's just start diving into the first topic, which is folder structure. So kind of the problem out of the box is when you create, like, let's say you go file new project and pick like a traditional server rendered MVC. So you're not doing like React or Vue or Angular on the front end. You're doing traditional server rendered MVC. And if you look at like what gets scaffolded out for you, you have like this control, like you've got this controllers folder, a views folder, a models folder. And then if you have any like custom CSS and JavaScript, those have to live in the www root folder. And like, even if you're not doing server rendered MVC, like you're doing, just creating an API or whatever the case is, like usually you get scaffolded out all these folders. And to add a new feature, you have to scatter bits of logic across these different features. And this just adds navigation friction because like the scope of a feature is scattered around. And what I found is when you want to like add or extend existing features, or like especially like delete them, you have to like go find where all those references are and like know where to go out of things. And this is like a very simple thing, right? Like we're not even talking about like repository services, like all of those kinds of things that a lot of people have in different folders that they have when they're creating their architectures. So my solution to this, instead of having all these different folders that kind of are grouped by responsibility, instead I use feature folders, which is instead of grouping by responsibility of like repositories or controllers or models, I instead like to group by feature for applications. And what I find is this results in easier maintenance because you have what's called high cohesion, which is basically a fancy word for saying related things remain together. So like MVC out of the box looks something like this. Like if I'm adding a My Profile feature, for instance, I got to like go add all these files. And this is like very simple. Like I'm not even introducing repositories or anything like that here. Versus a feature folder, it looks more something like this, where I might have like a folder called features, and then a my profile section with like the page, the relevant CSS, JavaScript, the view model, and the controller. So rather than scattering this out across these different folders, I'll co-locate them together, because ultimately all of those things, like we think like, oh, separation of concerns and things like that. But ultimately, like all of those things are highly, highly coupled together. Like your CSS file is highly coupled with your HTML, and same with your JavaScript, and same with like your view model is highly coupled to your controller and your view page and things like that. And so like if these things are already highly coupled, why don't we embrace that with high cohesion and kind of group them together? And what I found is like, I mean, this is a pretty simple example on the left, but you can imagine as you get tons of controllers, like that controllers folder just blows up and the models folder blows up over time. But I even use this concept in other technologies. So I've done a lot of React in my career. And so like I might have like a my profile folder in React and have like the CSS, the test file, and the component directly in the same folder. And like I've done a lot of Blazor too, and I might have like an alert component, for instance, and the relevant CSS file. And then maybe I've got like an alert type enum that's like related to the alert that I'm creating. Like maybe it's like, hey, I've got an alert type that's like danger, success, warning, whatever it is. That's like highly related to the component that I've got. So I'll just co-locate those things together. But like a lot of people, like, so some of you are probably like revolting. Some of you are probably like, oh, I'm already doing something like this with vertical slicing. And some of you are probably like revolting at this idea. And I revolted at the idea initially because I used to do kind of like those horizontal slice CS projects where I'd have like a data project and like a business project and a common project, models, and then like API or console or whatever the application is. And now usually what I just do is like two projects, like a core project or whatever you want to call it that like most of your business logic is. And then like your entry point project. So like it is an API project, a web project, a console project. Like that's typically what I do. And then of course I also have like a corresponding tests project as well, but we'll get into testing a little bit later. So like I usually slice the folders vertical there too. Now I will say a downside of this is, let's say you have, and this is kind of focused around like creating applications. Let's say you're like publishing your models to an internal NuGet repository or something like that. In that case, I would probably slice horizontally and have like a models folder or CS proj, so that way I could publish that internally and not have to bring like entity framework and things like that in. But otherwise, if I just have like one consumer and it's just my application, I'll kind of slice and dice it this way. So I've got some resources here. Again, these will be posted on my blog after this. Like I posted about this back in 2016 in how to do this in ASP.NET Core. There's a bunch of other resources here, including like vertical slice architecture from Derek Martin, who's got a great YouTube video. But I guess the last thing I want you to think about is this analogy of soap. So if you're still like, oh, I don't like how this is done, I want you to think about like in your apartment or in your house, wherever you live, where do you keep the soap in your house? Like, do you have a closet full of soap? Like, oh, there's my dish soap and my bath soap and all of that kind of stuff is in the same soap closet because it's all soap? I'm going to guess probably not, unless you're kind of, I don't know, I guess judgment-free zone. But more than likely, most of you are not doing that. Most of the time, you have your hand soap next to the sink because when you need to wash your hands, like those two things are related, right? Or you have like your bath soap and your shampoo in the shower and things like that. And you have your like laundry detergent by the washing machine. And the reason why you do that is because those two things are related. So you do that in your household. Now, I want you to think about like applying that to your code as well and keep those related things together with your code. And I think you'll find once you try that, if you haven't tried this before, that you'll actually enjoy having things sliced this way, or at least everybody I've talked to who's done this. I haven't run into somebody who's like, oh, I didn't actually like how we sliced that out. So That's kind of the last analogies, and you can use that analogy if you're trying to convince people at work to do this, because I think that soap analogy works pretty well. Okay. No eggs thrown at me quite yet for that one, so I guess we'll keep rolling on. But like I said, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to just shout them out. All right. If nobody's got any questions, next thing we're going to talk about is treat warnings as errors. So this one's a pretty fast one. I guess I'm curious, how many people maybe could raise your hand in the chat or comment in the chat? I guess I didn't pop open the chat window. Okay. No, I'm not recommending soap over rest. Don't worry. That would be I'm not that crazy. So I'm curious if you want to put in the chat or raise your hand. How many people ever cracked open a new project that you've never seen before and you went to build it and there's hundreds or even thousands of compiler warnings after you built it? All right. So far, Joe's the only honest one in the group. Vince too. Aaron. All right. Perfect. So yeah. And honestly, if you haven't, you're either like you work at a great place or you're flat out lying, because almost every place I've been has like some projects that have these compiler warnings. And in my view, a compiler warning shouldn't exist. Like it should either be like an error I care about and I go fix, like, oh, I forgot to wait, or hey, I forgot to do a null check, or I should actively ignore it and say like, you know what? On this line of code, I'm ignoring this warning, or whatever the case is. Or maybe I'm globally for the whole project ignoring this warning. And so like, I think it should be binary. It should be an error or nothing. And to flip this on, you can just flip on treat warnings as errors true. And now going forward, anytime you have a compiler warning, it will now flip it to an error. So that way, because what I found is when you deal with these projects with hundreds or thousands of warnings, like you just ignore them. And I would say probably a good portion of them are something you should care about. And so now this kind of enforces you to take care of those warnings before they become a big deal. So if you can do this on brand new projects, especially, so you're from the get-go, you don't have those warnings build up, that is definitely a good thing. So I see Vince, I inherited a legacy system with hundreds of warnings, so I just hide that tab. Perfect. That's amazing. And yeah, Vince, I've totally been there too, where it's like, I don't even want to look at that. I'm just going to put that off to the side.
Scott, we got a couple hands up, Jeff and Aaron to be specific.
Yeah, go for it. You can go ahead and unmute.
Oh no, I just left my hand up by accident.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just raising my hand to the, me too, man, with the warnings. Sorry, I didn't necessarily know how to do that. So.
Oh, no, you're good. Yeah. Sorry. I guess congratulations / condolences or congratudolences that you also have felt this, but it's definitely something that, I mean, you're not alone if that's any consolation. All right. Next I want to talk about logging best practices. And I kind of put best practices in quote here because anybody who tells you something is like best practices, I feel like that's usually like a synonym for like, this is just my opinions based on the situation I'm in, because more and more for my career, like when I used to think things were absolutes of like, oh, you should always do X. Like I always get, and this is what I like about consulting, is getting exposed to different things. Like I get hit with a consulting situation where I'm like, oh, actually in this situation, it makes sense not to do what I thought was the best practice. So that's why I kind of put best practices in double quotes, but I'll kind of give my general opinions about logging. Number one, if you're not already, my opinion is I like using Serolog as a logging framework just because it's got a lot of community involvement. Now, if you're using like nlog or log4net, that's totally fine too. It's just Serolog's usually my go-to. A mistake I still see a lot of people make though is when you're configuring Serolog or nlog or log4net, you shouldn't be really referencing that anywhere other than when you're like bootstrapping your logging, like when your app boots up in your program.cs. And so instead you should use the like iLogger abstraction that's built in to ASP.NET Core. Well, and technically it's even outside of ASP.NET Core. It's just built into the logging package. And so that way you're not tied to Serolog directly. So if you do want to switch just from Serolog to nlog or whatever, usually it's just like a handful of lines of configuration. But you should use structured logging, not concatenation. So instead of like searching for strings, you can actually in iLogger, you can use structured logging. So basically it turns your logs from like strings into like basically database columns. So you can like do like pretty robust queries, like for instance, hey, show me all the requests for this user and what they did in this time range. And you can kind of do it as like essentially like a SQL query, or if you're in Azure with Log Analytics, it's a KQL query. And one thing to note though is when you're doing structured logging, like Azure Log Analytics will cap at 500 unique columns, and then it throws it in the rest into like an other data column. So just something to be aware of. Nothing really, like if you have more than that, it's not really terrible. It's just something to be aware of, that like you'll have to go to like the other data column to see those other columns. But I also think like each log should have some key bits of information on them. So like Serolog has the concept of a log context. So you can like, rather than like, for instance, I might want to know who the user is on every single log. Well, and like throw the log user ID on there. Well, I don't want to do that on every single log statement. So the log context allows you to like set it up in a centralized place, and then all future logs has that piece of log information on it. And you're going to want other things like the correlation ID, maybe like the request URL. I also like putting like the version of the application of like, hey, this is version 1.0 dot, the build number, like 300 or whatever it is. So that way, like, let's say an exception happens. I think I fixed the exception. I can go query my logs and say, hey, do I see this exception in the latest version of my API or whatever the case is? So I really like having like the application version on there as well. So that way you can make some of those queries as well. And you can kind of know like, hey, I squashed this bug. We're not seeing it anymore. But I also want to, I just saw Vince's comment. If you need more than 500 columns in a log, you should be using a database. Yeah, so it's a good call out, Vince. So just be clear on that 500 columns. Those are 500 unique columns across all of your log requests. So you might have, like, for instance, some ripping out like the request URL, the like request, like was it a get, post, patch, whatever. Like those are all eating up like columns. And so it's like unique columns across all of your log statements on your entire application. So I have seen people go over 500, but not 500 on a single log request. So sometimes, like for instance, if I'm making a call out to, let's say, an external API like SendGrid to send emails or something, I might want to log something specific to SendGrid. Well, all of those count as one of my columns, even though the SendGrid functionality might only relate to one API request endpoint or something like that. So just so you know, it's kind of like cumulative across your application. So if I wasn't clear on that, that's kind of what I meant. So I have seen it go longer than that, but or some go bigger than that, depending on the application size. But I do want to talk a little bit about like we need to log that. And for instance, like what I mean by that is, like I've been in refinement sessions where we're talking about a story, and the product owner or somebody on the development team might say, hey, we need to make sure we log that. Like for instance, let's say we're building like a user management feature and we're controlling what permissions each user can have. Like, hey, you're an administrator, which means you can do these things. You're just a regular user, so you can just do these things. And like if you elevate somebody to an admin, we want to log that, right? And somebody might say, we need to log that, of log who made that change and when and all that kind of stuff. And that statement can be extremely loaded. And I find people don't really know what that means. And I'm not really going to get into like open telemetry because that's its own topic, whatnot. But I just want to kind of talk about we need to log that statement, because there's like a subtle difference between logs, metrics, and audits that I want to talk about. And again, this kind of feeds into open telemetry, but I'm not going to really dive into that because that's more implementation specific. I'm just going to talk like conceptually. So like logs in general should be more developer focused. So like if you're logging an exception, or maybe you want to like, hey, I'm calling that SendGrid API and I want to return like log what status code came back. Like those are really developer focused things, and you really shouldn't be exposing logs to like users or anything like that. And I also find a lot of people abuse log levels. So when you say like, hey, I'm going to log debug, like I find a lot of people don't log debug, even though they probably should. A lot of people abuse information. And really debug is meant to be like, let's say to fulfill an API request, you need to make like 3 database queries, right? And maybe you want to log like what the count was of each one of those database queries behind the scenes. You should really be logging debug for those counts, because debug is meant to be like steps in your process of like, hey, this first step, I had this count. The second step, I had this count. The third step, I had this count. And information is supposed to be like a summary of those 3 logs, or like your entire request. So you might have like an information of like, hey, at the end of the day, I filtered it down to like these records that I care about, and maybe it took this amount of time, whatever the case is. And that's really what information is supposed to be, is more of like a summary, not the step-by-step. But I find a lot of people use information as more the step-by-step for things. That's not a huge deal, but it's just kind of like a subtle thing that people misuse. Warnings are also something that people either misuse or don't really know about too much. But warnings are supposed to be like, hey, one of these happening isn't a huge deal, but if this happens a bunch in the aggregate, it is a big deal. So take like a user, let's say somebody's logging into your system and they lock themselves out. Like that by itself is not a problem. Like that's not an error. That's just like a typical course of business, and probably just a warning if somebody locks themselves out. However, if all of your users across your entire system lock themselves out, so you have like thousands or tens of thousands or millions of warnings of people locking themselves out, something is wrong. Like, why is every user locking themselves out? So like one warning by itself is fine, but tons of warnings in the aggregate could be an issue, an indicator of an issue. So that's kind of what warnings for. Errors are your typical like unhandled exceptions, and then fatals or fatals are kind of like, hey, my app can't boot. Like I need to talk to a database to boot up, and I can't talk to the database, or I can't talk to Azure Key Vault, or whatever the case, to pull secrets, or whatever the case is. So that would be an example of like a critical or fatal of you can't even boot. And I've seen people abuse critical too, when really it's more like your application can't even function. So like I mentioned, information's getting abused, but like you also need to think about, how long does my log store keep logs? Like, for instance, I guess I'll pose this to the group. Does anybody know how Serilog works under the hood when you call like logger.logdebug? Does anybody know how that works under the hood? And like what happens next? All right, so what happens next is, let's say you've configured Serilog to talk to Azure Log Analytics, right? Serilog does not, when you call a log debug, Serilog does not immediately go out to Azure Log Analytics and send an API request and wait for that to come back. What it does is it puts it on a background thread and like pools them up until you get a certain number. It's been a certain amount of time, or you get a certain amount of log requests, and then it flushes them out. And so what this means is let's say you call log debug and it's kind of waiting on the background thread, and then your app unexpectedly crashes. Like somebody essentially pulls the power on your API. That means that log that was in memory is no longer in memory. It is gone. And so some people use logs for like treating very sensitive data. So for instance, things like HIPAA requirements. So I have like a health insurance background, and you need to keep certain pieces of HIPAA information for like 7 years. And so if you're doing that with logs and Serilog, there's no guarantee that you have that log ends up in your log aggregator of choice, like log analytics, because it's not waiting for log analytics to come back, because ultimately at the end of the day, it's they're kind of making Serilog made the assumption like, hey, if your log provider's down, you don't want to take your whole application down. So that's kind of their thought process. So you kind of need to think about like, is it okay to not have a 100% guaranteed delivery of logs? Like for an exception, that's probably okay, or debug, that's probably okay, but for like HIPAA logs, that's not okay. And so that kind of feeds us into like metrics next. So there's really kind of two types of metrics. There's application metrics, like what's the CPU, network, response times, those kinds of things. And then there's like the business side of like, how many times did somebody click the download button for this type, like when they're downloading this type of PDF or whatever the case is. So again, you kind of need to ask yourself, how long do we need to keep that metric data? And is it acceptable to miss some data? Like not having CPU percentage for a minute is probably okay. But if you're making like big business decisions off of like the business metrics, then you might need to consider what data store you're hitting. So again, you kind of need to think about like what data store you're hitting, because like Log Analytics Workspace, for instance, I think by default keeps things for 7 days or 30 days. I can't remember offhand. But which is fine if you're just storing like exceptions and things like that. But if you're storing HIPAA data that you need to keep for years, that is not okay, right? So that kind of leads us into audits. And so like if you need that HIPAA data that we're talking about, or like that when we're creating like a user management system and tracking who elevated people's permissions, that's kind of recording who did what and when in your application. That's more of an audit. And usually you have this for like legal reasons, like HIPAA, like I mentioned, or traceability reasons. And this is like where losing any data is unacceptable, period. And so like the simplest way is just store those audits in the same data store as the data that's being audited. So if you're using SQL Server, put it in SQL Server in the same transaction as the data changing. That way, if you can't log the audit, you don't actually record the record and make the change at the end of the day. So, but again, a lot of people like they say like, oh, we need to log that. And they think, oh, I need to use a logger because we said the word log. And it's like, no, think about what it is that you're trying to do. So that was a bit of a tangent, but that's kind of like, I think there's like a nuanced version between like logs, metrics, and audits. And there's a whole nother thing with like open telemetry and traces and things like that too, but I'm not really going to get into that. But just want you to think more about that, because one of the worst spots you can be in is somebody says, hey, who did this? A year ago or 6 months ago or 3 months ago. And then you're like, oh, shoot, we have it in Log Analytics and that only goes back 30 days and you can't answer the question. That data is gone, right? Like that's a really bad place to be. So really just kind of think through that situation. All right, looking at before I move on to this next one, I'm just looking at the chat here real quick. Info logs should be infrequent enough to be searchable. Debug logs usually have to be filtered down to a timestamp to make them valuable. Yes. Use triggers. SQL Server has history feature I've never used. Temporal tables. Yep. So temporal tables is one way to get audits. There's a whole bunch of ways to do this. Like Entity Framework, you can, if you're using Entity Framework, you can hook into Entity Framework's DB context and like access the change tracker and figure out what's changing and all that kind of stuff. Like there's a million ways to do some of that stuff. Yeah, it just kind of depends on your scenario. Okay, so this next one we're going to talk about is a global authorized attribute via a fallback policy. So what is that? So kind of the problem out of the box, and again, I kind of frame this up as like problems and then what the solution is like by default in ASP.NET Core, if you go file new project, its security is opt-in. So if you're using controllers, you have to remember to add an authorized attribute everywhere. Or like you might have some custom base controller that has an authorized attribute, but you still have to remember to inherit from that. Or if you're using minimal APIs, you have to remember to put like require authorization around your minimal APIs. And what happens if you forget? It's like, oops, you're wide open to the whole world. And this actually happened to one of our clients. The very first day we started working with them is we came across about half of their APIs that they had forgot to add the authorized attribute to things. So it was literally wide open to the world, which in their case was really bad. So that was a fun first day when we had to inform them of that. And luckily, it was not us, just to be clear. It was a previous full-time employee, but yeah, that was definitely not a fun conversation to have. So the solution is to be secure by default using something called a fallback policy. And a fallback policy is the authorization policy that gets evaluated if no other policy is specified. So what I mean by that is when you're going to build your application, you can do like call the add authorization and then give it some options here and saying like, hey, the fallback policy is like, we want to build up this policy and require an authenticated user by default. But you could imagine you could also like require certain claims or whatever makes sense by default. Hey, to hit my API or hit my application, you need to have passed this metric. And so what happens here is this only gets evaluated if no other policy is specified. So if you have another authorized attribute, let's say in a controller that says, hey, I need an authorized attribute and you need to have like this claim or this policy to pass, that takes precedence over this. This is just by default, if there's nothing else there, it will hit this fallback policy. Likewise, if you just specify like allow anonymous, because maybe you've got an endpoint that you should allow people to be anonymous. If you specify an allow anonymous attribute, that will take precedence over this. But by default, this means any new endpoint we create, you at least have to be logged in order to hit it. So this is kind of secure by default and not relying on you remembering to add the correct authorization. Like you at least have some baseline by default. And again, you can kind of customize this how you want in case you want to like restrict this down further. Like maybe by default, you want them to be an administrator or whatever the case is, depending on your scenario. So that was a quick one. That is fallback policies. Vince asked, would it be better to have the fallback intentionally reject everything so you have to be intentional about who can get to it, like a not implemented error in a new method? Yeah, absolutely. So you could have a fallback policy that basically nobody can pass and like doesn't exist basically, because ultimately like this is just like a shorthand for creating a new policy, but you can also create like a custom policy that basically nobody can satisfy. And you by default, it's just like, I can't remember when you create a policy, it's like context.fail or something like that. And so you could just have that be in the method and like basically reject everybody by default to force people to think about what should be there. So yeah, you could absolutely do that too. All right, cool. Let's next talk about validation. So again, I'm going to kind of present this as a problem, kind of like out of the box. You have data annotations that we all know and some of us love. And what I find with those is those only really work well for simple scenarios, and it's kind of hard to make custom ones, or it's just kind of awkward, I guess I should say. Not really hard, just awkward. And so these are like saying, hey, this property is required and things like that. Those are kind of the data annotations. I also find they're hard to unit test as well, and we'll kind of get into testing a little bit later. And I find separate annotations for each property can get like tall. Like maybe you say it's like, hey, it's required and it needs to be an email address. And maybe you also have a custom one that's like, it has to be an email address that's these domains or whatever the case is. And you kind of are stacking multiple properties on top of each other. And you could also make the argument that the single responsibility principle, not problem, single responsibility principle is violated because you're combining like your models and your validation combined into one class. So the solution to this is to use Fluent validation, and it's Fluent interface. I've actually given these business rules, and we'll take a look at an example here in a second in case you haven't used Fluent validation. And I would be curious, people in the chat, how many people are using Fluent validation today? But really, like I've used Fluent validation rules to like business people, and like literally giving them a code, and they can read it and see what's going on. So I'll be like, hey, are these validation rules correct? Which is pretty cool. So it's easy to show somebody. They're easy to test. Integrates with model state, and it's got a bunch of downloads. And there's the link. So what this looks like and is like when you go file new project and select a identity project where you can like sign up with a user and things like that. if you scaffold that out, you'll end up with like this register view model. And all these things on arrows are kind of like the validation rules that are part of this. And so instead, if I refactor this with Fluent validation, basically all those rules go away there on the left. And it's just kind of like, hey, the properties and some display things. And then on the right, how it works is Fluent validation, you inherit from an abstract validator of T, which is the model you're validating. And then in the constructor, you can create all these rule fors. So you can say like, hey, email should be not empty. And when I get that, then I want the message email is required. And similarly for like password, and then like the email address should be an email address, and like all of these things. So you kind of have these nice rules that are built out. You can also like, I'm kind of repeating like email is required, password is required, things like that. You can customize this message. So I can say like, hey, when I pick not empty, I want it to be like the display name is required. So you can do things like this, crazy things like that as well. So you're not kind of repeating yourself over and over and over again. But you can also add like a rule that only exists under certain situations. So like, for instance, like this is a pretty basic one of here in the US, you can have a kid on your health insurance until they hit 26. So we're getting health insurance. This is very similar to something I did where, hey, when you're signing up for like enrolling in health insurance that you do every year, we want to make sure that your age is less than 26 when this is a dependent. And then have a message with, hey, the dependent must be younger than 26. So like you can also create like custom rules kind of in line here. You can also like bake all this logic into a method and like pass it a method that it must pass and have that pass in that method and return true or false, depending on what that is. I see Duncan has his hand up. You want to just unmute, Duncan? Duncan, if you're saying something, I can't hear you. Can't unmute. All right, do you want to type your question maybe? I'll keep rolling until you get that question out there. And yeah, so that's kind of what Fluent validation is compared to data annotations. Is this a validator for front end distinct from a unit test? So when you say a validator for the front end, so what Fluent validation is more like, so let's say you're making an API, right? This would be like kind of your request models coming in. So like if somebody's trying to create a new user, for instance, you're going to have a model, whatever that looks like, whether it's a command or some sort of model that represents that request of saying, hey, I'm trying to create a user, and making sure that that request passes validation, because more than likely that create new user request comes from some sort of form on like a web page or mobile app or whatever the case is. So if you are using like server rendered HTML, so like MVC or Razor pages, you can also have these rules. Like Fluent validation will cascade these rules down to the front end. So it integrates with jQuery validation. So it'll actually create like client side rules for you for free just by defining them server side. So that's kind of how the validators work. If you have like validation logic on like how to construct a domain object or something, like you might want to create, like have that not in a validator. You might want to have that like in the constructor, like required properties, so somebody can't like create an invalid object. But if you're taking in a request from like a user, like they can absolutely create an invalid object and kind of like bypass your client side code and things like that. So yeah, so not limited to front end. Yep. Cool. And yeah, if you didn't get a chance to ask your question like in one section, like feel free to just drop in the chat or raise your hand or whatever the case is. Like happy to go back to an older section too. All right, so the next one is the server header. So by default, ASP.NET Core, I guess specifically Kestrel, adds a server header. Does anybody know why Microsoft adds a server header that it'll say server Kestrel? Like, why would it add this response header that says server Kestrel? You can unmute or drop it in the chat, and I'll give you a hint. It's not a good reason. Joe is correct. Analytics. So the reason why Microsoft added that was because they want to know how many websites out there are built on ASP.NET Core, because if you're just serving up HTML or making an API, you don't know if that's built in .NET or Java or Node or whatever the case is. So they added this server header to get some metrics around it. And that server header says Kestrel. The problem with this is, yes, Duncan is correct. This makes it easier for hackers and things to know what you're running. So if I know you're running .NET, I no longer need to scan you for all of the Java vulnerabilities or Node vulnerabilities. I just need to scan you for .NET vulnerabilities. Now, removing this doesn't necessarily absolve you from vulnerabilities, but it just gives them more information to make more targeted attacks and make quicker attacks, because they might give up after a while, right? So instead, what you can do is you can configure this turn this option off and say builder.webhost, use Kestrel, and say add server header equals false, because by default this will not be turned on or turned off, I guess, in this case. So again, this does not protect you if you are running .NET 5, which has been out of support for a while now, but it's kind of think of the lock in your house, for instance, or your apartment or wherever, is locking your front door doesn't mean nobody can get in. It just means it's a lot harder to get in, right? Somebody could still bust a window or knock your door down. It's just if it's locked, it's a lot harder than if it's unlocked. So I would say this is more like you're locking the door a little bit and making it a little bit harder for somebody to exploit a vulnerability you might have, but it definitely is not saying, hey, flipping this off suddenly makes you secure. It just makes it a little bit harder for people to figure out what to exploit and things like that. Joe says, I used to work in obfuscation software, very much the same idea, prevents low-hanging fruit attacks, but doesn't absolve you from actual defenses. Yep, absolutely. Okay. This next one we're going to talk about is a little spicy, is don't use I options, which is kind of clickbaity. But I'll talk about what I mean by that here in a second. Is if you're using I options today, it is kind of annoying to deal with, and I guess for those of you, for what I'm talking about, I options is kind of like the configuration system of ASP.NET Core to pull in connection strings, whatever else configuration that you have. But if you have other CS projects, now you got to add a dependency to Microsoft Extensions options, as well as if you're testing I options, maybe your constructor depends on I options. Now you got to do options.create to satisfy your constructor. And then you have this friction where you're injecting in I options. In this case, I'm assigning it to a property, but you could do a primary constructor or whatever here too. Is now you got to do dot value when you want to get whatever your value is. So you can't just say hey, grab me the thing. I got to do dot value and whatnot, which if you're assigning it to a field or a property or something like that, it's just kind of annoying to do. So instead what I do is I register my options class directly. So what I mean by that is I still have this one line up here that's saying, hey, configure app settings, and here's the section I want you to grab, just like normal. But instead now I'm saying, hey, add a singleton. We'll come back to the singleton thing here in a second. Add a singleton and then grab me the required service of ioptions.app setting or of app settings, and then grab the dot value. And what this does is in the DI container, it throws the app settings object into the DI container. So now all I have to deal with is my app settings object, which is usually just a POCO, plain old CLR object that's got just properties on it. So this is nice because now all my downstream services or CS projects don't have to depend on that options project. I don't have to do dot value everywhere, all of that kind of stuff. Now, I do want to come back to this add singleton. So the way I've got this set up here is basically the configuration will never restart or reload unless you restart the application. So you might be like, oh, that sucks. But you can totally have live configuration with the same thing. You just, instead of add singleton, you do add scoped. And then instead of iOptions, you'd use iOptions snapshot, and that would totally work fine. So then you can like reload configuration on the fly. If you're like changing an app settings value, although you really should not be reaching out to production server or anything and changing your app settings.json file. Like that's just not usually a great idea. Because like if you typo, like forget a trailing comma, you're going to crash your whole app and things like that if it's invalid JSON. So like in general, don't do that. But if you're using like Azure app configuration or some external configuration mechanism, you can totally still reload configuration on the fly. So this does not absolve you or does not limit you in that way. So just a little nice thing I learned from somebody named Andrew Locke. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's just a nice little like removes a little paper cut for you. All right, so that is iOptions. Next, we're going to talk about code smells. These are just generic guidelines. In general, when I'm structuring a method, I like to have the happy path at the bottom of a method because I don't want to like scan in the middle of a method for what happened. Like if I've never seen this method before, like what happens when everything goes well. I want to kind of know that by looking at the bottom of a method. So I can use early returns instead of like nested if else's. So what that looks like is like if you go file new project and select Razor Pages, like identity, this is like a create user flow. This is actually the happy path of the method. So it's like log for information, sending a confirmation email, sending the email and signing them in. It's kind of in the middle of the method. And so what's funny is like there's also this comment in here that got thrown in by Microsoft of if we got this far, something failed, redisplay the form, which is almost always an indicator when you have to comment on how the code works that something is amiss and it's not super clear on what happens. So instead what I would do to refactor this with the happy path at the bottom, I would first check is the model state valid and return or invalid and then still return the page. So basically if I get past this point, I know people submitted the right data to me. Next, I'm going to try and create the user. If that doesn't work, then I'm going to redisplay the form after adding the model errors and then finally, do all my normal stuff. So this allows you to have like less indentation and in general, like just makes it easier to read in my opinion. Some people like or don't like having multiple early returns, but I'd say try it out if you haven't and kind of see what you think. Cause like I like knowing like, oh, when I'm down here, I'm in a good spot versus like back here, I have to kind of keep track of where I'm at with these ifs and like what they are and what the state of them are versus here it's a little bit easier to like know like, okay, I'm not nested. Like if I've got here, I'm in a valid state. So this leads me into the indentation proclamation. So this is the idea that the more indented your code is, the harder it is to follow. And so like if you've ever dealt with a lot of nested if loops, if statements or if loops or things like that. Sorry, I was just moving the chat around. That's like really hard to follow what's going on. So the more indented your code is, usually the harder it is to follow. And if you Google the indentation proclamation, you're not going to find anything because I just made this up. And so this concept doesn't exist. But I find it's easy to remember because it rhymes and it's easy to remember like, oh, the more indented I am, the harder it is to follow. So some generic code smells. These are not hard and fast rules, just kind of my warning light. Methods that are more than like 20, 30, 40 lines, I start to get a little nervous. Classes that are more than 200 lines, I start to get a little nervous. And anytime you create a region, some of you aren't going to like this, hot take is, I wish like when people tried to create a region in code, like Clippy popped up and said, hey, it looks like you're trying to add a region. Did you mean to make a new class or method instead? Because like we already have ways to organize code, which is classes and methods. We probably don't need regions for the most part. So let's also kind of just like, again, these are kind of my warning lights, not necessarily hard and fast rules. Although regions, I definitely do not use regions. That is a hard and fast rule. All right. I don't see, somebody's got their Duncan. Was that just hand raised from before? guessing so. If not, just drop in the chat and I'll take a look a little bit later. So like next thing, HTTP security headers. 90% of people don't know what these are. From what I've found and like the public data that's out there, is HTTP security headers tells a browser what extra rules to enforce. This protects a bunch of different attacks such as man in the middle, clickjacking, cross-site scripting, ton more. But be careful because you can break your app. So for instance, you can say, like if you've ever gotten a pop-up saying, hey, allow your microphone, or hey, allow your location, you can actually tell your application like, hey, I don't use the location, so don't allow anybody to use the location. Like if you drop in like a marketing script or whatever the case is, it would block that. But if you actually do the location, now you're breaking your application. So you kind of have to be careful about this. There's a library there called NetEscapade's ASP.NET Core security headers. And I do have a talk on this that's out on YouTube. Again, I'll post these slides to my blog where I talk about this for like a whole hour about security headers. But just to show you how bad security headers are and how many people don't know what they are, if I go out to securityheaders.com, and I'll bump this up a little bit, you can see like this will scan your site on what security headers you do and don't have. And you can see of all the sites that's ever been scanned, 148 million of them, so almost half of the 334 million got an F, meaning they have no security headers, and only 45 million got an A or an A+, so probably 15% or so. So you can use this. You can use the site to scan your sites to see if you're doing it. But like I said, most people don't even know that these things exist. So I also always use security headers as well. All right, next one: build once, deploy many times. I'm a big fan of kind of like GitHub flow, meaning you have like a main branch, and then you create these like short-lived feature branches, and then you merge them into main, versus having like environment-specific branches, specifically when you're creating like web applications and APIs and things like that. And so if you have these long-running like environment branches, you can run into situations where like what's in dev and test are like so different because they have different commits and things, that it doesn't actually give you a ton of confidence that things actually work. So this encourages trunk-based development or GitHub flow. And actually Atlassian calls Git flow a legacy workflow. So just to show that real quick, I'll just pop open that link. And you can see, like Git flow has fallen in popularity in favor of trunk-based workflows, and they talk about how it's not a modern workflow. So if you ever want to like convince your company to get away from Git flow, you can use that as an example. Atlassian makes like Jira and Confluence and tools like that. So they also discourage that. As well as like if you have a single main branch, this encourages continuous integration, the practice of like continuously integrating your code, not just like the build server side of things. Could talk a whole day, like an hour about that specific topic, but and I find too, like then this promotes like environmental differences, like secrets and configuration live in the environment itself, and you don't have to like rebuild the entire app just to get your new configuration or secrets or anything like that. All right. Joe asks, for code differences between environments, do you recommend feature flags? Yes, we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But yeah, if I'm saying, we'll get into that with continuous, I'll talk about continuous deployment a little bit too here in a second. But yeah, if you want to say, hey, this feature is only turned on in like dev and UAT, but not production, that's where you need to have a feature flag, which for those of you not familiar with feature flags, is literally just a fancy word for an if statement. Like if the flag is on, execute this code, otherwise skip it or don't execute this code. So, yep. All right, validate on build. This is also a quick one. So in dependency injection, singletons can only depend on singletons, otherwise they aren't singletons. So if you have a singleton that depends on a transient or scoped, now it's not really a singleton, and you end up with this problem that's known as the captive dependency problem, because you've got a scoped or transient service that needs to be disposed of, but it's captivated by singleton. And ASP.NET Core by default will catch this when you're running in the development environment, but not other environments. So like if you are running locally with like a custom environment name like local or dev or something, then you're not going to catch this error locally. So what that situation is, if I have like a singleton thing and a scope thing, and the singleton thing depends on the scoped thing, the error you're going to get is basically like if you have this, if you're running in development, is you're going to say, hey, you can't consume a scope service from a singleton. So they're trying to warn you of this issue. So I've seen people accidentally have like a singleton that depends on like a database connection of some sort, and that database connection either never closes or just isn't disposed of correctly. And so if you're hitting that issue, you might be like that symptom, it might be coming from this issue. But really, I want this turned on in all environments, because like if I have a custom like environment called local, like I want to get this on my local machine. So to flip that on, you just do builder hosts, use default service provider, and flip on validate on build equals true. Now that on build, you might think that's like on compile, but that is not the case. That is on the building of the service provider, like the DI container, not so it's going to be a runtime error, not a build error. So that name is kind of misleading. But that's what this is. And I find 99% of projects don't have this flag flipped on. And most people don't even know that that captive dependency problem can happen. And super easy if you don't kind of think about what's going on. All right, next we're going to talk about automated tests. I realize we're kind of running low on time here. You should be writing automated tests. There's tons of studies out there. If you go to dora.dev specifically, they've done like tons of studies with tens of thousands of companies, and they've proven that automated tests makes you move faster in the long term. I would highly recommend using XUnit. That's actually the one that the ASP.NET team uses, but if you're using NUnit, that's fine too. I don't really like MS Test, because even though Microsoft made it, just because it's a little bit more verbose. And ironically, Microsoft themselves doesn't use MS Test either, because the .NET team and the ASP.NET Core team use XUnit, which I think is kind of funny that they don't use their own product. That leaves me to this concept of Chekhov's gun. And Chekhov was a Russian playwright back in the 1800s who said this quote that is basically, if you have a gun hanging on the wall in the first act of a play, it should fire off in a later act of a play. Otherwise, it's shouldn't be hanging on the wall in the first place. Now, you might wonder like, hey, what does this mean to automated testing? And really the key takeaway here is everything in the story should be relevant. So let's apply this concept to testing. What is not relevant in this particular test for what we are testing? You can unmute or drop in the chat. What is not relevant to the story to what we're trying to test? Anybody? Waiting. First name. Yes, first name is not relevant to the test. Neither is address, neither is birthday, because what we're trying to test is, hey, this is only when last name is empty. So this is all I really care about right here. This other stuff is just noise that I don't really know what's relevant. So if I apply Chekhov's gun to this, I might rip that like creation of a valid customer out into a method or a factory or whatever the case is. And then I'll just tweak it to say, hey, my last name is set to empty, right? And so this is a lot more clear of what is relevant. But I might also go next level with XUnit, where XUnit's got basically like a before each test, they run the constructor, and it's not shared state between tests. It's literally it creates like a new instance for each method, each test method that you have. So it's not shared state. It's just like helper, I guess, fields and things like that. And so I might rip that out to the constructor and create a valid customer in the constructor, and then just tweak the test to what it is that I want. But then I might go next level too. Instead of newing up the customer validator, I might create a new validator up in the constructor too and rip that out. So again, I'm kind of like removing the parts of the method that aren't really relevant to this particular test, and just left with what's relevant to this particular test. So if you kind of look at those two approaches, like what I saw before versus after, you can see like we shaved off, half the lines of code or so. And I find this with like mocking, for instance, too. And I'm not going to get into mocking too much, but like if you're mocking up services, like I see sometimes the same mock set up in each test and returning the exact same data. I would rip all that out and either like have a method that is doing that mocking or like move that up to the constructor. So that way you're not seeing like all these mocks getting set up and things like that. So I just want you to think about Chekhov's gun and apply it to testing and try and make sure that your tests have everything that's relevant to the story in them, because it's really hard. Like once you have like 20 plus lines of arrange code and setup code in your tests, it can be really hard to figure out like what's going on or what's the difference between that test and this test and things like that. All right, just a handful more here, or just like two more here. Next, we're going to talk about centralized package management. I'm curious if anybody's using central package management. If you want to like raise your hand or drop in the chat, either way. But I'll kind of keep talking while people are doing that. Central package management allows you to have the same package in multiple projects across your solution. So, which if you don't have central package management, then you have to like keep these versions in sync. Like maybe you have multiple test projects, you got multiple versions of XUnit and nsubstitute or whatever the case is. And it's kind of annoying to keep those versions in sync, especially test project. And I find like, I'm going to say like 6 or 7 out of 10 people don't know central package management exists. And so what the solution is in .NET 6, they added this concept called central package management. And you create a directory.packages.props at the root and define the packages and versions there. And then in your consuming CS projects, you omit the version attribute. So then you basically just say package reference include entity framework, or package reference include XUnit. And you don't say like version equals, because you kind of define it in this single file up here. And then all the other projects use that version. And you can override each with a version override attribute if you want, but then that kind of defeats the point of central package management. So what that looks like is in your directory packages props that you're probably going to have in like the root of your folder or your repository, you kind of set up this managed package version centrally true, and then you define all your different packages there, like XUnit, Entity Framework, ASP.NET Core, whatever the case is. Like you list those all here. And then in your consuming CS projects, you just say package reference include the package name. And so you don't have the same version. So now if you ever want to bump XUnit, you do it in one spot and not in, let's say it's in 3 CS projects. You don't have to bump it all in all the CS projects. So it's a really nice way of doing that. And it's been in .NET for the last 3 years now. But again, I find most people aren't using it, and sounds like not too many people here are using it as well. So just want to call out attention to that feature. All right. So next we're going to do some rapid fire bonus topics. If you've ever wondered what SQL queries Entity Framework is making under the hood, switch the log level of Microsoft Entity Framework Core database command to information, and then you'll start to see it. And I'll show an example of that here in a second. However, make sure you only do this for local development. Like do not do this for production, because you're going to create so much noise in your logs in production. So do not do that. So what that looks like, so for instance, if you're configuring logging through app settings, you just flip this on here, and then it'll show you down below saying, hey, I did this insert into this table, and here's the columns and the values and all of those kinds of things. So if you ever want to know what any framework is doing, by default, that's how you would do that. And that question about possible security problems depending on the query. Yeah, so by default, you can kind of see here, like the insert into, it just shows you the parameters, so you don't actually get the values. There's another setting you have to flip on to get the values, and I can't remember what it is offhand. But if you really want to get the values, you'd have to flip it off. Otherwise, all you're going to get is the queries. So like even you can see down here in the where statement where the normalized email is equal to like the parameter. So you don't even get like the value in the where statement. So yep. Good thought though. I'm a big security guy, so I love your thought process, Joe. So some more bonus. If you're not doing CI/CD pipelines to like automatically build and deploy your application, you absolutely should. Like I will help you for free. If you're not doing this, just come talk to me. I would love to help you. Because if you're not doing that, that's probably like the number one thing you can do to like move faster, more reliably, is set up CI/CD pipelines. But I also want to talk about this concept called confident green. And this is kind of something we've coined internally. Like, we don't really talk about it externally too much besides stuff like this. But I want you to think about, like, let's say you've got a CI/CD pipeline, and a lot of teams I see are doing continuous delivery, not continuous deployment. And continuous delivery is this concept that you automate your deployments, but you still have to manually click a button to deploy it to prod. Like maybe you auto deploy to all your environments but prod, and then you have to like manually click a button. And what I want you to think about is like your whole build process up to that point was green, but you aren't confident to go to production. Why? And what I find people say is like, oh, well, in dev, I usually go play around and do this thing. And it's like, okay, and make sure that that still works. And it's like, okay, that sounds like an automated test. So why don't we add an automated test around that? Now, why aren't you confident to go to production automatically? And they're like, oh, well, I don't have zero downtime deployments. Okay, we can fix that. Now why? And like you kind of just iterate over this and think through all these situations. And even if you don't do continuous deployment, what I find is it still sets you up in a better place going forward. So we try and push like continuous deployment as much as we can. So like if it's green, it goes all the way to production, but you need that safety net of like good automated tests, zero downtime deployments, those kinds of things around that. And it was alluded to, I can't remember if it was Joe or who asked. Yeah, it was Joe asked about feature toggles. That's where feature toggles or feature flags come in, where you say, if you're going all the way to production automatically, you need to be able to say, hey, if I'm in production, don't flip this feature on quite yet because I want a product person or a business person to look at it first. And so to do continuous deployment, you're going to need feature toggles. And literally, like you can start with just like flags and app settings.json, or you can graduate all the way up to like some tool like Launch Darkly or something like that, where you can flip it on outside of making a code change. So feature toggles are also a key point of this as well. And I would say too that, or just want to add that Dora.dev site that I mentioned, which we can get into that more later if people are interested, is that they also advocate for feature toggles as well. And notice the most high performing teams use feature toggles. So if that's not something you're looking at, it's definitely something to look at. Also, work in small batches. Like we all know this, like the easiest, like if you do lots of small things, that's way easier than like one large thing. So like try and think about how you can work in small batches in general interest. Like if you're deploying continuously with continuous deployment, usually you're just like deploying one thing at a time. And so if there's an issue, you know, like, oh, is the one thing I just changed, versus if you're waiting like every week or every 2 weeks or every month or every 6 months, now you've got a batch of changes and you don't exactly know which one caused an issue if there is one. So working in small batches can help with that too. Like I said, deploying frequently, in my opinion, you should try and target daily if you can. And this is also a spicy topic. If you have like a front end system and then like a back end for front end API where that API's only consumer is that single front end, I don't like splitting those up, because now like you probably have like a pull request in your front end to do all your front end code like React or Angular or Blazor or whatever it is. And then you have the corresponding changes in your backend code and like they're split between two PRs, and like trying to like marry those up can be difficult when you're doing a code review. So I'd rather combine those things, because again, they're tightly coupled at the end of the day. If you only have like a single API for a single consumer, if you have an API with multiple consumers, I would not do this. I would split it out. But if it's tightly coupled like that, I would just put it in the same repo. Same with infrastructure as code. If it's tied to your application, I wouldn't put that in another repo as well, unless it's like shared infrastructure that you got. So just talk about real benefits of these practices. One company we worked with used to deploy 12 times a year, and they rolled back about half of those. And they used to spend a week a month just doing deployments and like dealing with like getting ready for the deployment. And we, by doing some of these practices, we got them deploying over 2,000 times a year. And I think last year they rolled back twice out of all those. And so they're not only deploying and those rollbacks were like were feature flags that they flipped off. Like they weren't even like redeployments of the code. They're just like, oops, we flipped a feature flag on. It's not handling this type of user, whatever the case is. I'm going to flip that back off. And so like there wasn't really any downtime. It was just like the feature didn't work for a few people and then they turned it off. So obviously this means like you're deploying faster, more reliably. You're also getting business value out sooner, because like if you're deploying once a month and you finish a feature on like day 1 of the month, it's 29 days or 30 days before your users actually see that feature in the wild and benefit from it. So obviously you're getting value out more faster as well. So that was the whirlwind of this talk, and sorry I went over on this. Thanks for everybody who hung with me. And yeah, I guess, does anybody have any questions? If you want, you can pop off mute or ask them in the chat. I also know some people don't like asking questions in a group, or maybe they've got a very specific question. So you can shoot me an email. I got my email there. Happy to answer any question that you have. If it's not obvious, I like talking about this stuff. So yeah, any questions anybody has?
I don't see any hands raised or any questions in chat, but I did notice multiple people had commented that it was definitely a lot of great tips, and they all appreciated your presentation, and likewise as well.
Perfect. And like I said, I'll post these slides up on my blog. I intentionally keep these slides pretty detailed, so you know like exactly what I said without having to watch the recording later. Because I always hate like when I pull down a slide deck that somebody has and it's like just a picture. And I've got some of those talks too, but like I'm like, I don't remember what they said about that picture. So I intentionally kept this pretty detailed so you can like pass this along to people on your team or look at it later. So, but I'll get that posted like here in the next 5-10 minutes.
Excellent. Appreciate it, Scott. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm also going to post a few links in the chat window, and unless there's any other questions or comments, and it looks like there is none. So if I may, I'd like to share my screen and go through some wrap-up slides.
Perfect.
All right, so if you take a look over in the chat window, you see that there's 3 links that are posted there, and we'll go through those. The first link is for the YouTube channel, and the recording will be edited and then will be posted on there just a couple days. But if you would please subscribe to the channel to get the upload notifications. In addition, tech events will also be posted on my blog, and you can also subscribe to that to get the updates. And last but certainly not least, a link to the feedback eval form. Please take a moment to fill that out so we can provide Scott with some constructive criticism.
Definitely. I'd be curious, like, I always like asking what's one thing you would like absolutely keep in this talk and what would be something you would cut from this talk. Because I'm always curious, like, what people resonate with and then what they didn't resonate with. So yeah, if you do fill out the feedback form, and if it's got that option, I guess I don't know if it's got that option, but would really appreciate hearing what people's thoughts are there. You're not going to hurt my feelings.
Very good. Speaking for myself, I can tell you there's a lot of keepers in that presentation. So, but I will pass on the feedback that I get.
Perfect. Appreciate it.
Sure thing. Also, regarding regional events, so many of these user group meetings are held virtually, so you can attend them online. On October 7th is the Ohio North Database Training Group, and that is essentially a group for SQL Server developers and other database professionals. That meeting is hybrid, and it is both held online as well as in person, so you can check that out. It's held every first Tuesday of the month. On October 8th is the Azure Cleveland User Group, which is held every first Wednesday of the month. And then on October 16th is the Akron AITP User Group, and they're going to be doing a tour of a data center of one of the local vendors. So you can check that out, and the link, like I said, will be posted on my blog. On October 16th is the glug.net User Group, or the Greater Lansing User Group for .NET users, and that is an online meeting available to everyone. And I'm not sure if they have the topic posted yet, but they're definitely maintaining a monthly cadence, specifically on the third Thursday of every month. And then on October 22nd, which is The fourth week of the month is the October meeting of this user group, the Cleveland C# user group. There isn't a speaker lined up yet, but again, we're following a monthly cadence as well, so it will be posted soon. And then lastly, regarding conferences, SQL Saturday Pittsburgh. I don't know if any of you are familiar with SQL Saturday. I personally am a big fan of it. It is basically a community-driven event that covers a variety of topics related to data, whether it's SQL Server, Postgres, or a variety of other database topics. And as you see, the schedule that's posted covers a variety of topics relating to Fabric, analytics, Tableau, and then yours truly will be giving a presentation on creating ML models with Python and SQL Server. This is a free event. If you'd like lunch to be covered, I think it's a nominal fee of $15, but essentially it's an all-day event. And in addition, they also have a pre-con, which is Fabric Analyst in a Day, and this is a free one-day workshop that's going to be given on the Friday before the event. So the link for that is SQL Saturday, and it lists the date there, 2025, 10/18. And again, the link is posted on, or will be posted on my blog. The other thing that I always like to cover are jobs. So I always like to ask, who's hiring and who's looking for work? If you would please make yourself known either in chat or verbally, and we can share it with everyone else. So anyone hiring or anyone looking for work? Aaron is looking. Where are you located, Aaron?
Cleveland, Ohio.
All right, another Clevelander. Very good. Anyone hiring? All right.
So we're currently hiring, although it's local to for us, which is Des Moines, Iowa. So not sure it's going to be relevant to you all, but we've got a opportunity that requires some on-site. So yeah, unfortunately, probably not relevant to a lot of folks, but if you're interested or you're in the Des Moines area or close to it, feel free to reach out to me. I'll just drop my email in the chat if that works.
Yeah, please. Good to know. Thank you for sharing.
Yep.
And then for those that are in the job market, check out devitjobs.com. This is a very interesting website that allows you to filter by technology, region, whether it's remote or on-site. So it's a very useful tool. And again, the link for that is devitjobs.com. Lastly, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly, snasser@nistechnologies.com. You can also find all my socials on Linktree/SamNasser. And more importantly, if we're not connected on LinkedIn, let's do so. It's a great platform. I post a lot of articles on there and interact with a lot of other people. You can also get a look into some of my videos that I do on LinkedIn Learning. So it's a great way to connect. And so with that, if there's no questions or comments, thanks again to Scott for a great presentation. Thank you all for joining us, and look forward to seeing you all next month. Good night, everyone.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you, Scott.